Well, quite a lot indeed, Kathy. We will make use of the next 20-odd minutes to try really and unpack some of the events that took place today. Let's start, Karima Brown and Ebrahim Fakir, if we may, with that briefing by Nati Mthethwa on the strategy and tactics of the ANC. Essentially, Nati Mthethwa saying, look, we're not going to go the route of other liberation movements. There is no scientific logic to the theory that 20 years down the line, things start falling apart. What did you make of that?
Well, I think it's a denial of what President Jacob Zuma said in his opening remarks, where he said the ANC's internal research had indicated that the party was in trouble, particularly in the three large metros, which they turned out and lost in 2016 in the municipal election. So it's very clear, Vuyo, that the ANC is prepared to acknowledge up to a point that it is in trouble, and then almost by way of decreeing itself out of trouble, declares its own research unscientific. So I didn't I wasn't convinced by Nati Mthethwa's diagnosis and his reference to SWAPO, for example, about the fact that SWAPO was in similar problems and had managed to reconnect. And of course, what Nati Mthethwa didn't say was that the largest problem at this stage is, of course, actually the ANC itself. The ANC president is facing unprecedented calls from within his own organization that he steps down. He's facing a vote of no confidence. Those who are potentially going to vote with their conscience are being threatened with expulsion. That hardly looks like unscientific evidence that the party is not in fact in trouble.
Ebrahim Fakir, Nati Mthethwa says, look, what we saw in 2016 local government elections was just a warning. It's not a crisis. It's not telling us much. We know what is wrong with what we've been doing, and we actually have the ability to self-correct, and that's all we need. Let's not even talk about coalition. The question was asked about coalition. It says, no, we're not even talking about that because we know what we need to do. But do they?
Well, they don't, and clearly he's contradicting what his party as itself said, which is that they need to prepare perhaps for coalitions come 2019 at the national level. Of course, it remains to be seen. So he's right about that fact. I mean, none of us have the foresight to know what the future says. So he's right, but only about that. But it was almost a schizophrenic briefing in the sense that he says things which the party says, and then he contradicts himself completely after that. But for me, the fundamental thing is the mischaracterization and the misapplication of particular context. So liberation movements in other countries did not preside over a society in which the private sector is such a large role player. They also didn't preside over societies in which the stage of historical development didn't reach the stage of historical development that South Africa has, because South Africa is in fact quite a developed country, ranking probably in the top 3 with regard to accounting and audit standards, even though that's in decline. And they certainly didn't preside over the management and administration of such a large number of resources. The third mischaracterization is that South Africa has successfully built over the last 23 years the largest social democratic welfare state in sub-Saharan Africa. Now that's a big gain that the ANC can actually leverage off. Where the ANC has failed has been at the level of economic growth, presiding over economic growth and ensuring a sufficient redistribution of that growth. And it's also a big problem for a party in government to disregard the fact that it has lost control of the 3 key drivers of growth and redistribution, which is the key metros. Once you lose leverage over a citizenry which is connected to the circuits of global power, of commerce, of industry and of government, you've literally lost control over the society. And the British Labour Party in 1979 had lost control over the London metropolitan area, as well as the decline of mining in the north of Britain. And that was the cataclysmic loss of the Labour Party to a Thatcherite Britain. And the ANC faces a similar crisis in historical terms today.
Now, one of the things, when asked about corruption, for example, he says the ANC has set up very strong institutions that are actually dealing with corruption. But then these are the same institutions that a number of them are actually being increasingly captured, isn't it?
Well, I mean, let's just start at the right place. The first thing that the Zuma administration did back in 2007 when it came into power was dismantle the Scorpions and replace it with the Hawks. And of course, the character of the two institutions very, very different. But even when the Hawks was set up, successive, people who headed it up, someone like Anwar Dramat, for example, removed, replaced with a person whom the courts had found unfit. And even then, it was only after a new minister had come in that we saw the political support from that particular minister being withdrawn, and of course, Burning in Tlemeza, leaving, the institution. So hollowed out as a weapon, against corruption. And of course, who can forget the National Prosecuting Authority? I mean, technically, we are still waiting for Shaun Abrams to explain to the President why he should not be suspended. And this, of course, after the disaster involving the former Finance Minister, Pravin Gordhan, on those trumped-up charges, which were so dramatically instituted and which had such a very negative impact on our economy and which had to eventually be withdrawn. Those are just two indications, Vuyo, of the very clear pattern of capture and, more importantly, of its use to settle political scores linked to the factional battles for control of the African National Congress. President Jacob Zuma himself has been at length trying to stay out of the courts. We know the National Prosecuting Authority is desperately trying to get away from a court decision that effectively means they have to reinstate corruption charges against the president, which emanates from, an investigation into him before he in fact became the president of the ANC and of the country. So this reference to strong institutions against corruption is rhetoric. It is there on paper. We've seen the email scandal. There's prima facie evidence. We have seen PRASA having to take the Hawks to court to get them to, in fact, comply with their constitutional mandate. So the ANC's diagnosis and its reference to institutions that are part of the architecture to fight corruption is rhetoric. This ANC administration has, in fact, denuded those organizations' ability to deal with corruption, in a very comprehensive way.
Well, economic transformation was, of course, the other big issue that came under discussion. In fact, there's a commission still ongoing as we speak. We're going to discuss that with Ebrahim, Fakir and Karima Brown. That's after this short break.